and welcome to World History with Professor Wolf. This audio-video lecture has been produced for my Calvin University History 153 Borderlands and World History course in the season of the COVID-19 pandemic. Chances are high that you're watching or listening to this because you're a student in that course. But if you've just stumbled upon this or are watching or listening out of general interest, I hope that you too find it interesting and educational. Now, so far in our course, we focused in on borders, walls, and borderlands of the pre-modern world, including those early walls constructed by the world's first civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt thousands of years ago, and also the more widely known later walls and frontiers that were built by the Roman Empire and Imperial China. And more recently, we had a brief look at the New World and some of the frontier developments of ancient societies across the Americas, and we then read through and discussed excerpts from Frederick Jackson Turner's American Frontier Thesis. Now today, we're moving into the much more recent past, to just about 100 years ago, on the eastern border of France. While our assigned reading deals with both early 20th century border issues in China and France, we're going to focus our attention in this lecture on France's Maginot Line. So what was the Maginot Line? Well, the Maginot Line was a massive series of fortifications built by France throughout the 1930s in order to defend its borders with Germany and Italy. Now, from our perspective in the 2020s, we can see this as a development that sits between the two world wars. In its time, though, the Second World War had not yet happened, and it is best for us to understand the Maginot Line in the context of the aftermath of World War I. So first, what was World War I? And what happened then to make France undertake such a serious border defense as the Maginot Line? Now, at the risk of oversimplifying, World War I began in 1914 and ended in 1918. And it featured the so-called Central Powers, that is Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, fighting against the so-called Allied Powers, which included Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Romania, Japan, and the United States. Now, while trouble had been brewing throughout Europe for some time before the war broke out, the tipping point that started World War I was the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand on the 28th of June in 1914. Now, only 1 month later, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and within a week, most of Europe had entered the war. Particularly important for our topic today is the fact that Germany invaded Belgium and then began to advance toward France, and by September of 1914, the Germans were within 30 miles of Paris. The Allies held back this early advance, but the war took a turn as opposing sides dug trenches, and this hellish war of attrition continued for the next 3 or more years, finally ending in the fall of 1918. Dubbed the War to End All Wars, World War II saw the death of more than 9 million soldiers and almost 10 million civilians, with France and Germany seeing the bulk of those casualties. So, it was this aftermath of the First World War and the millions of lives lost, particularly amongst the country's young men, that France began to develop serious border defenses. Given what they had experienced in the preceding years, establishing a strong defensive position to protect against a future threat seemed to be a good idea, and work began on fortifying France's eastern borders in the early 1920s. By the late 1920s, the idea for a continuous line of fortification had been widely accepted, and under the new Minister of War, André Maginot, extensive work was underway. The main idea was that a linear defense must be able to effectively slow or halt an invading force long enough for a full mobilization and deployment of the French army. Now, this was based on lessons that they had learned from World War I fighting, about the benefits of a strong defensive perimeter, and also including specific post-war examination and reevaluation of some of those major battle sites, identifying what went wrong and what worked well. Now, contrary to popular ideas, the Maginot Line was never intended to be a permanent, impregnable barrier. But the master plan was for a barrier that was strong enough to hold off enemy forces for about 20 days, so that France's full fighting force could be mobilized. And as Adolf Hitler was rising to power through the late 1920s and early 1930s, alongside Benito Mussolini's rise in Italy, the possibility that these fortifications might be needed seemed increasingly likely. Now, as with some of the Roman frontiers that we looked at in previous weeks, such as Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall, my favorite, the 20th century French Maginot Line was also a complicated and in-depth system of fortifications. In some cases, the various components presented a defensive zone of up to 25 kilometers or 16 miles from the time you'd enter the line until you had passed through all of the defensive components. Now, overall, the line was composed of an intricate system of strong points, fortifications, and military facilities, such as border guard posts, communication centers, infantry shelters, barricades, artillery, machine gun, and anti-tank gun emplacements, supply depots, infrastructure facilities, and observation posts. All of these various structures reinforced a principal line of resistance made up of the most heavily armed ouvrages, which can be roughly translated as fortresses or big defensive works. And it is those ouvrages, these semi-underground fortresses, that featured extensive bunkers and underground facilities that most characterize this line. While the ouvrages could be observable above ground, their underground extents were much harder to determine, and small ouvrages could house between 100 to 200 soldiers, while the larger ones could house crews in excess of 1,000 men. Now, over its entire length, there are known to be 142 ouvrages, 352 casements, which are basically fortified artillery gun emplacements, and around 5,000 blockhouses, very small fortified structures that served as the first line of defense. Now, although the line to build this fortified border was not Maginot's, he had led the first serious phase of construction. The line was built all throughout the 1930s, and even though Maginot himself died in 1935, the system of fortifications was already being called the Maginot Line by that time. So, that's a very brief summary of how the Maginot Line came about, what it consisted of. But was it ultimately effective? Well, to cut the story short, not really. War erupted once again in late 1939, and in the first part of 1940, Germany basically went around the Maginot Line, invading France via Belgium and the French coast. Direct German attacks against the Maginot Line didn't start until June 1940, but by this point, the French army was already mobilized against the Germans elsewhere. And that big idea to use the line as an opportunity to buy time so that the French army could be mobilized was already impossible. They already were mobilized. In June 1940, France signed armistice agreements with both Germany and Italy, who had both invaded across the Maginot Line. And the last of the Maginot Line ouvrages surrendered in July of that year. For the next 4 years, France was occupied by the Germans, and parts of the Maginot Line were put into use by those occupying Germans, who specifically reconfigured some of those large ouvrages as underground bomb-proof factories. By 1944, though, as the Allied forces were gaining ground in France, the German army put the Maginot Line back into combat, this time trying to protect themselves from the U.S. General George S. Patton's 3rd U.S. Army. Now, Patton's forces prevailed, and even the U.S. Army then brought portions of that original French fortification into use as their own unit defenses. Following then the end of the Second World War and the Allied victory, the French government would go on to repair damaged portions of the Maginot Line, and it maintained the line well into the 1960s as part of its own Cold War defenses. By this time, though, military technology and the nature of warfare had changed quite dramatically since the 2 world wars, and even though the Maginot Line defenses were impressive, it had become obsolete. Now, from the late 1960s and throughout the 70s, the line itself was abandoned, and significant portions that had been owned by the French military were sold off. And today, relics of this World War era national fortification system are tourist destinations. And when we can eventually leave our COVID-19 lockdowns and the world returns to some form of normalcy, perhaps many of us will be able to visit some of these sites ourselves. So, that's the Maginot Line in a very brief nutshell. It's obviously a lot more complicated structurally than I've been able to describe here. And its history is much more involved than the summary I've given. I hope, though, that this gives you a sense of how the Maginot Line came to exist, some of the factors that were involved in its design, and some ideas to think about in regards to whether or not it was effective. Now, if you're a student in my History 153 Borderlands course, I'd like you to particularly think about the relationships between this particular frontier and some of those others that we've been investigating across this semester. Here's some things to think about. Why was the Maginot Line built? And how does this compare to the walls of Shulgi, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, the Emperor Qin, and China's later Ming Dynasty? Do you think that any of these earlier linear frontier systems were influential in the design of the Maginot Line? And if so, can you think about which specific components or design elements might derive from ideas and knowledge about some of those ancient examples? And finally, as with all of the linear barriers that we've explored, what are some of the ways that this frontier was effective? And what are some of the ways in which it can be seen to have failed? Now, that's all that we have for today. I hope this was useful. I hope it was educational. And I really look forward to the next time we're together.